What's going on, everyone? It's another episode of the WVSports.com podcast. I'm Wesley Shoemaker, joined by, as always, the one and only Keenan Cummings. So, a bit of an emergency podcast this evening. Keenan, the first four is starting tonight,
Did you
but
wear black for a reason? Are we both wearing black for a reason for this?
no, I think you could even call this a gray. But there is some news coming out of Morgantown, unrelated to a governor going after the NCAA, unrelated to any of that stuff. Darian DeVries is gone. He is headed to Indiana. Today is March 18th, 2025, 355 days ago, March 28th, 2024, was his introductory press conference at WVU, and then less than a year later, he is now out the door, headed to the Hoosiers, headed to what is amongst the top caliber of programs in collegiate basketball. Um, their expectations are as high as anyone's, and they have not delivered on those expectations. So DeVries now steps into a pretty hot situation right off the bat. But for our sake, Keenan, we now have another coaching vacancy of a major sport at WVU, another basketball coaching vacancy. We will be having our fourth coach in 4 years. And so now you and I will break all of it down and what is next for the Mountaineers. So, raw reaction. I know we were kind of getting the national guys weighing in on DeVries throughout the day. Thamel hit on it on McAfee's show. Thamel also hit that Iowa was out of the race. I think Goodman was kind of the first to link DeVries to the Indiana job earlier in the morning. And then it really picked up some steam throughout the afternoon before becoming official this evening. So we'll start there with you, just your overall reaction and thoughts on DeVries heading to Indiana.
Well, I think the one thing that we need to be clear about is I know there was a lot of talk about Iowa, and Iowa had kind of been center stage, but even on our message board, Vernon and myself and some others were replying throughout the week. It was more Indiana that seemed to be the concern if they set their sights on him. I think West Virginia had enough in terms of NIL, in terms of facilities to fight off Iowa. And I think that was made abundantly clear when DeVries it came out today that wasn't going to happen. I know there was a lot of smoke out there, and you're always concerned about someone going home, but that's something that almost seemed like a smokescreen of sorts with what was going on with Indiana. And I don't want to say you were hoping that Indiana wouldn't make him, their prime target, but once that became clear, I think the way that it was addressed earlier today by Pete Thamel kind of was the nail in the coffin for me. That's when I started to really get to work on what was next. I had thought this could be a possibility. It kind of became a reality to me there. The way he addressed that on McAfee's show was essentially West Virginia is putting up a good fight, but Indiana's Indiana.
The fight isn't good enough.
Yeah, for a Midwest guy. And I think that unfortunately that's kind of where we're at. The sad part, the part that's going to frustrate a lot of fans is this hire was built around being a long-term thing. After what has seemed like endless instability, since Bob Huggins' radio comments, really, I know that he survived that, but since then, obviously Huggins resigns, Eiler takes over. There's all the roster trouble, all the in and out. DeVries takes over, puts together a roster, and then Tucker gets hurt, Stone gets hurt, they get left out of the tournament, and now you're looking for a coach again. That's going to lead to a lot of frustration, and I understand that. I completely understand that. Imagine covering it. It's quite the ride there as well. I will say, at least some of you, if you want to, can unplug from it from a little bit. I don't have that liberty, so it's a sad situation. I was going back and reading some of my articles when DeVries was hired, and he said that this was a place he thought he could see himself at for a really, really long time. Turns out that was less than a year. Any way you slice it, that's frustrating, and I understand. I want to be kind of play both sides here for a second. It's easy to look at that and get really mad that a guy left in a year, but also coaching changes there's never a good time for a coaching change for a guy you want to keep. So whether this happened this year, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, I still think people are going to be mad, upset. That doesn't in any way excuse what happened. I think people have a right to be upset. But that's where we're at. West Virginia and Ren Baker are now back in the pool. The good news with that is he is experienced. He just went through a whole list of candidates last year. Some of those candidates have made their way back onto our first hot board. We can get into some of those if you want here in a bit. But, Baker has a process with this. This program still has a lot to sell. Losing a coach to Indiana, I know Indiana is underachieved on the floor, but it's still a premier basketball program. They paid over $5 million for their roster this year, over $5 billion. There's not a lot of schools out there that can do that. I think I read that West Virginia's was around 3, which is the first time I've ever gotten a number on it. But that's good too.
I think Pete Nakos of On 3 kind of reported that because I think he talked about the Iowa number 2 and how that was a lot lower than what West Virginia's number was, which if you're a West Virginia fan and you're comparing jobs through that NIL number, that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, whether or not DeVries goes to Iowa or not, you're still competing with Iowa now for another head coach. So we'll see what happens there. But I think that's a healthy number for West Virginia. That's better than I expected. It's unfortunate that kind of you only got to see 8 games out of Tucker because obviously he's going with his dad in Indiana. That shouldn't surprise anybody. But the part I think that is really going to, once again, kind of just another chink in the armor in a really rough week. You get left out of the tournament in a shocking development. Your coach leaves a few days later, and now you're facing the transfer portal coming up, kind of similar to last year. At least by now, you had an idea who your coach was going to be, started to zero in at least. Right now, you're entering into a search where time is going to be moving quickly. You don't know what's going to happen to the roster. Jonathan Powell is already in the portal. Well, is going to be in the portal. Tucker DeVries is going to be in the portal. Those were 2 of the cornerstones you were going to build your team around next year. So clock's ticking, Wes. I trust Ren Baker in this process. I think he's done nothing but make the right hire. Just because this didn't work out at West Virginia doesn't mean it wasn't the right hire at the time. I mean, I think that you'd find very few people that weren't impressed with the hire of Darian DeVries, what he was able to do this year. And I'm taking nothing away from him as a basketball coach. I think he did an excellent job with what he was given this year. And that's the unfortunate part for West Virginia because you're losing a damn good basketball coach in the process.
Yeah, I think for all the fans that kind of want to complain because it's a one-and-done year, if Indiana comes knocking on your door for a basketball job, and you're probably going to take it. It's the same thing as if like Alabama came knocking on your door for a football job. You're probably going to take it. Or if the Dallas Cowboys or Pittsburgh Steelers, like they're a marquee program in the sport. And just because he left, I don't think it's a slight at West Virginia. If anything, it's a good thing that Ren Baker got a guy that Indiana then wanted. That shows that he knows what he's doing. And basketball is Ren's thing. I know that Thamel talked about that, but like that's an important thing here. Is like Ren gets hoops, and that's something to keep an eye on. And yeah, we've done this already once in the last year. So he has good relationships with guys. It was no accident that Thamel kind of legit set up the table for everything to happen today on McAfee's show. It was no accident that he goes on there, and Ren and Thamel are pretty in the know with each other, I would say. I think that's fair to say. And he kind of not only straight up said what West Virginia was doing, but kind of what DeVries was doing too. Like, oh, Indiana, he's obviously in the process with Indiana. But then he said, don't expect West Virginia to be behind in this process because Ren Baker is prepared. He's always been prepared. He's always said that no matter what sport, what coach. A couple formalities to kind of go through here. This was Ren Baker's statement. And
I think that's a very good thing to read a statement. I mean, because I thought it was
telling. It showed kind of what Baker's hand was and all of this. Like he showed that he kind of went after him a little bit. So here it is. Coach DeVries informed me of his plans to accept the head coaching position at another institution. Coach and I had several conversations in recent weeks focused on working together to build on a strong foundation and continue to grow our program. I made it clear to him that WVU is committed to invest in him and provide the resources needed to compete in the Big 12 and nationally. Ultimately, he decided to move on, and I want to thank him for his time at WVU. We have an outstanding basketball tradition with some of the most loyal and passionate fans in college basketball. We have tremendously generous supporters and a great partnership with the university that allows us to compete in this new era of college athletics. The alignment between the leadership of our board of governors, the university, and athletics department is strong, and I am confident our momentum will continue as we work diligently to identify the next leader of our men's basketball program. The second part is kind of just selling what WVU is to the national scope, who's going to see that. But the first part of that is very interesting to me, and I think we can probably get into that, is how he talks about what him and DeVries did the last couple of weeks and how it seemed like there was probably a little birdie in Ren's ear that said, hey, DeVries might be a top name for some of these jobs, because we knew this Indiana job was opening up for a good while, right? Like this was a thing that was not a secret. And so it's likely that Indiana probably might have zeroed in on DeVries a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month. Like, you just don't know when that timeline was for them. Um, and things get around. And so I think that the sentence of, I made it clear to him that WVU is committed to invest in him and provide the resources needed to compete in the Big 12 and nationally. Like, it seems like Ren tried. Like, Ren tried his best to keep Darren at West Virginia.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question there. And, there were talks of an extension. We had heard that.
We talked about that on Sunday.
Yeah, you had heard that was close. West Virginia felt that was going to get done. And you just look at the timing of it all, too. If West Virginia makes the NCAA tournament, does this happen? Does Indiana wait around? You never know. So you go back to that as another kind of type deal with West Virginia. But in the end, I mean, it is what it is. You can't change time. It's happened. It's over. And now West Virginia's got to kind of move forward. You still have a recruiting class to try to hold together, which I know that's different now in today's era. But you got a kid in the state, Braden Hawthorne, that I don't care who the coach is, you want to keep. He's been absolutely fantastic. And you'd hope you can keep the other two guys, but they were pretty tied to DeVries in the first place and some of his assistants. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. With the roster, how they're going to piece together the roster. What's it even going to look like? Is there anybody left? Is this 2.0 of last year where the entire roster is gone? I mean, there's so many questions that need to be answered, and we can't answer any of them until we know who is going to be the next head coach. So that's going to be the focus. That Ren Baker is very prepared for these, as we mentioned earlier. He keeps a list. He's talked about that since he got hired here. Always, you never know what could happen, whether a coach underperforms, overperforms, school comes into the mix that maybe you didn't expect. I thought it was telling last night, his comments on Sportsline too. I think that you could tell that he felt that, with so much talk about Iowa, that he was in a good spot there. And, talking to our Iowa Rivals guys, one of the things they mentioned is the lack of NIL support. And it's a problem there. And if West Virginia is going to be competing for, let's say, Ben McCollum or any of these other coaches that are on the board, that's something you can sell if you're West Virginia. And I think that it's important not to get lost in the frustration that West Virginia still does have a lot to sell as a basketball program. Ren Baker's not wrong. The tradition, the fan support, the conference, all of that checks the boxes. That's going to attract high-level coaches as it has since the job has become open. And you're going to have another chance to kind of go. And I don't want to say make it right, because I don't know if DeVries, it ended up being wrong. But who knows, if a couple things happen differently, if this unfolds the way it does. I still think it was a good hire. I can't knock Ren Baker for what unfolded. He has no control over that. I think I personally believe, and from what I know, he did the best that he could, to keep DeVries here. But that's the nature of college athletics now. It's always kind of been that way for coaches, but it's kind of that way for everybody now. It's just so hard to keep things together, and you're really building a new team every year anyways, whether you lose your head coach or not.
Yeah, I think the biggest kind of thorn in the side for West Virginia fans will probably be the expectation that this was going to be a long-term thing with DeVries. And then now it's here we go again. I mean, I know you texted it to me, the article that you read, and you mentioned it earlier in the pod here of how DeVries said he wanted to be here for a long time. And this was a place he could see his family long-term, et cetera, et cetera. And now it feels like he's burning the bridge because he's going to Indiana. But I mean, I think that it's hard. Like when you look at it from the professional standpoint of the step up from West Virginia to Indiana, like we understand it. Obviously, it's different for fans because they have the emotional ties to this thing, and they were there this year. And truthfully, Keenan, this broke at what, like about 6 o'clock this evening. That's legit 2 days to the exact time of the selection show on Sunday. So it's been a rough couple of days for Mountaineer fans, and this obviously doesn't help. But going forward, there's a lot of names that could be out there for West Virginia for Ren Baker to work with. You mentioned Ben McCollum. If if I'm Ren Baker, I would assume he's near the top of that list. He was working with Ren at where was it? What Southwest Missouri
Northwest
State?
Missouri State.
Northwest Missouri State at the Division II level, where he had tons of success, and this year he's back in the NCAA tournament with,
Not ironically, Drake.
Drake. I mean, talk about that carousel that might get going if McCollum comes here. But there's another couple names on here. I know you released a hot board, Keenan. Nico Medved.
Some
Will
of our
Wade.
names that were last year, we're familiar with some of these
Yep.
names. Jerry Calhoun,
Yep.
Medved, Will Wade. I know we've got a lot of Will Wade fans on the WVSports.com message board, so I'm not sure how that will unfold, but that's another name. And there's a lot. I mean, you got to give a guy like Chester Frazier. I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
he was the one wild card I thought we should kind of bring up if you want to kind of start that thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I don't know when you determine if a guy's ready, but he knows the program. Obviously, he's been here a year. He's a good coach. He's a good recruiter. I'm not sure if that will be the direction Ren goes. It's not been kind of his MO, since he's been here, but it's a name. It's a name that's out there, and I think it deserves inclusion. There's probably some other guys. There's some guys that have performed well. You're always going to have some guys kind of pop up. So there's probably names out there right now on Ren's list that we definitely don't have on there yet. And we'll try to find out as much as we can. Hopefully, all indications are, at least early into this process, that this should be a relatively short search. And by that, I mean anywhere from 10 days to I don't know when the hell it'll happen. But you never know with coaching searches. They kind of take on a life of their own, and going to be a lot of kind of eyes glued to the message boards, to Twitter, me and you trying to find out
Flight
as much
tracker
as we can.
season, Keenan? Are we running this thing back? Flight tracker season?
Flight tracker season's back in effect, all of it. So there'll be a lot of stuff coming out in the next couple of days, from us, obviously, on candidates and, how this thing's unfolding, because I think that there'll be twists and turns in the beginning. And, last year I was happy to say that Darian DeVries was one of the first names on our hot board and ended up being the hire. So hopefully the process is smooth once again. And I have no reason to believe that Ren Baker's not going to find a very comparable and qualified person for this job. There's just so much going for the program, and I think people have to remind themselves of that, because this is kind of one of those days where people are a little down. Oh man, my coach left to go to Indiana, and we've explained it. Indiana's Indiana. They have some resources on the basketball side that makes it tough for West Virginia. Whether or not West Virginia, which arguably West Virginia's been a better basketball program in terms of on the floor for a while, but in terms of what they can offer, I think they, as I mentioned earlier, they paid over $5 million for their roster this year.
Oh, that's something we haven't mentioned yet, is the money that West Virginia will be getting back.
Yeah, that needs to be that. I was surprised by this too, because I had looked at the contract and not seen this. But Pete Thamel again said that West Virginia, I had it around 4.6, I think is what I said.
Yep.
And he said he's going to
that's the number from his direct contract, I think. But then I think with everything included, it's 6.15 is what Thamel reported, which is a lot of money for the Mountaineers to work with.
Yeah, I mean, you're not only going to have all the things we mentioned earlier, you got a pretty nice little armory of change there to go around and dangle a little bit. So I think that will help, in this search process. And I'll be interested to see what the buyout looks like on the next head coach, how that's approached. And, what kind of, I don't know if you necessarily can learn from something like this. I legitimately believe there's not much Ren could have done outside of what he did, but it will be interesting to see how things are structured moving forward, and, what happens to a lot of pieces that kind of put this whole thing together.
Yeah, I'm also interested because portal opens less than a week from today. The 24th, I believe, is when it opens. So next Monday. Obviously, there's a lot of coaches on the list that we had that are coaching either Thursday or Friday, and then that could obviously then stretch into Saturday or Sunday, depending on how they do in those first round games. So a lot of moving parts. I mean, this was kind of where we were at this time last year, though. I think we were in a very similar spot of Eilert moved on right after conference championship. That's when like they parted ways. And then here we are, like it was like that Sunday. So the Sunday of I think the first round, I believe it was like
Yeah,
that so the
because
Sunday
Drake
after
lost
the
the
first
first
round,
round
yeah,
game.
Drake lost the first round game, and then that Sunday. So if it would be the 23rd. If it's the same schedule as last year, it was the 23rd. Obviously, there was a lot more time to kind of go through this thing, but now you have those resources that were prepared. But just a general timeline, that's where we were this time last year. One thing, I mean, it's a talking point that I've seen on Twitter from all the crazy West Virginia fans on Twitter, Keenan. The plot for DeVries to get to Indiana a while ago, and Tucker kind of masking the injury. Thoughts on that, Keno, and how
I
any conspiracy theory from you there?
I I don't believe so.
I
I
don't
mean,
think so either.
he was injured for sure. I had heard about that before it became public. I had heard after it happened it was going to be a season-ending deal. The only thing that surprised me is how long it took him to get surgery, but I think that was more of him trying to get back than it was
Hmm.
anything else. That's something I think I had told you before Atlantis that I had heard.
Yeah,
There were issues there, so it's if it was a con, it was a hell of a long con. So I
it's
think
it's a hell of a long con, and I'm not sure competitors would ever really kind of do that.
no.
That's just not something that either of them would really do. Um, But yeah, so here we are, coaching search. If here we'll play the guessing game. So over under a week from today, West Virginia has their new head basketball coach in place. So
Do we know it
before,
or is it announced?
do we know it?
I'm gonna go over. I think these things just normally take
A,
even the quickest searches
a
usually
few days longer than the
usually take unless Ren absolutely knows who he's hiring right now.
unless he's zeroing on one guy and
Yeah,
he's
we if you hear about it super quick, then this thing was already well in the works. If you don't, then it's pretty typical. But I do think it'll be wrapped up rather quickly compared to some of the searches that West Virginia has had to get gone through. But really, I think Ren's been pretty efficient with most of them that I've been part of.
yeah, I think the longest one might have been football this past
And
year. I
and
think
that really
football.
wasn't even that long.
It wasn't
It
that
just
long.
felt like it
It just
was.
felt long because we were cycling and cycling through everything. But yeah, so I think it's hard to like not look at Ren's track record and be like, all right, like you're good to go, like and trust him. I mean, there's nothing that he has done at West Virginia that should say he is not good at picking coaches. And that was the big thing when he came here. Like that was obviously before all the Hugs drama, but you knew Hugs' age and how he was more on the backside, obviously, of his career. And then the football team had the big question mark around it. And he's done pretty well. We talked about it I think we talked about it the other day, about all the hires he's had across West Virginia sports, and so we'll see what happens. But if you're a fan, I think you're okay to understand that you're getting a lot of buyout money. You have a good NIL in place, and you have an athletic director and a new president coming in that seems to have some level of alignment between both parties.
Yeah, and just the commitment from the school and everybody involved.
Yeah,
West Virginia wants to compete at a high level, and that matters. Coaches want to be in programs like that. You've heard Rich Rodriguez say it a bunch. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but you get the feeling it's almost night and day than from the end of his last stint to now in terms of where the commitment's at and what he wanted to see. So I think that helps. And you got that practice facility. You have a lot to work with. So I'm not worried. I think West Virginia will make a good hire. I don't know who that is yet, obviously. I don't think anybody does unless Ren Baker's already got a guy in mind and he ain't telling me.
he ain't telling me either. So that'll do it for this episode of the WVSports.com podcast. Hey guys, now's a great time. If you are not on our website, if you are not subscribed to our forums, I mean, we got to do this plug last year with the Neil Brown coaching search, but here's another coaching search. If you want to hop on our forums, hop on the Blue Lot. We will obviously be putting all of our information there that Vernon finds out. Like, Vernon's going to be on this. He was on the football one from the jump. I assume he will be on this one again. And then we will continue to get after it with all of our content, all of our normal stuff. Spring football is still going on. Luckily it's spring break this week, Keenan. I will say.
Yeah.
So,
perfect timing, right?
Perfect timing. But until next time, I'm Wesley Shoemaker, joined by Keenan Cummings. If you made it this far, we do appreciate you listening. And this was another episode of the WVSports.com podcast.